Hey y'all, this is Ben. I'm here with another episode of Prairie Fire, and joining me today I have Matt Christman, the co-host of Chapo Trap House. Matt, thank you so much for coming on today. Of
Hi, thanks for having me.
course. So today we're going to be talking about a little bit of the history of the religious right in the U.S., the Christian right. Um, and for me, growing up in Texas, and pretty conservative area, I it was kind of always omnipresent for me. Do you have any personal experience kind of interacting with the Christian right in this country?
Not really. I'm from Manitowoc, Wisconsin, which is it's a sort of a miniaturized Rust Belt city on the coast of Lake Michigan, about an hour north of Milwaukee, and it's got a similar ethnic breakdown. So it's a lot of like German Catholics and stuff. There was not a very strong like evangelical mega church vibe. It was much more the coastal like Rust Belt industrial working class town, not like the whole Sun Belt vibe.
For
So
sure.
I never really encountered it growing up too much. Now,
Okay, cool, cool. Well, you can count your blessings in that regard. They're not my favorite faction in this country. But, you know, the U.S. has ostensibly always been a majority Christian nation. You learn in school about how the country was kind of founded as, it was explained to us back then as people seeking religious freedom. In reality, a lot of it was their religion was a little too deranged for Europe, and they needed a place to call their own and kind of practice it. So you had groups like the Puritans, etc. But the first real attempt to like factionalize the Christian right in the U.S. was in 1863. Some would argue, and that was when representatives from a bunch of different denominations of Christianity came together and founded the National Reform Association, which tried to add an amendment to the Constitution, which would officially declare the U.S. as a Christian state. But that's really early stuff. And when we talk about the Christian right, you don't really think about Civil War days. We think more about getting into the 40s and the 50s, and anti-communism played a big role. Um, what's your take on how the Cold War kind of set the stage for the Christian right in this country?
well, it gave a spine to the package of reactionary social positions that the right, the Christian right in America started to experience over the course of the 50s, namely things like the civil rights movement and threats towards the ending of formal and informal racial segregation, and that the attack that had on like conceptions of what a stable society could be, but also all anything else you can name could all be tied to a greater narrative of a attempt by an enemy that is explicitly against God, and that could give shape to an entire narrative that delegitimizes all social conflict that is even remotely threatening to what your preferences would be.
Right, right. This figure of sort of the godless communist became a great enemy in the discourse. Um, do you think that sort of narrative around communism and socialism had a significant impact, or do you think the impacts are still kind of felt by the state of the left today?
I mean, yeah, I think there's a certain there's a trauma associated with communism that means that everybody feels the need to express that trauma one way or the other, and some of them do it by needing to compulsively denounce communism, and like the Soviet Union, for example, or other people who feel the need to defend it. Either way, they're expressing their trauma around and their anxiety around the concept of communism because of the place it's held in America's psychic history. And I think that, as with many things, the only thing that's going to overturn that, and is, I think, with time, is just more and more people coming into activism and into the left who grew up after communism was no longer a living threat, no longer something that had such huge psychic sway over people.
Right. There's a lot of people from my parents' generation who have that kind of like progressive instinct, you could say, that sort of compassionate look at politics, but are unwilling to sort of delve into that class consciousness because of the stigma around socialism. So the 40s and 50s really kind of set the stage. A little anecdotal thing that I learned about in some of my research for this, and that you just kind of hear passed around, was the Pledge of Allegiance was written by a Christian socialist, and it originally omitted the one nation under God. But if I recall correctly, I think it was Eisenhower who inserted the God.
Yeah, that's correct.
Sorry?
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. So Eisenhower, obviously, I've talked a little bit about him on this podcast before with his endeavors in Guatemala and other places to kind of quell communism or any semblance of leftism. That really did set the stage for kind of this sweep into the 50s and 60s and 70s. A figure that is an interesting man whose progeny is the subject of many humorous headlines today is Jerry Falwell.
Yes.
Many people point to his moral majority as a big institution of the Christian right. What do you associate Jerry Falwell with?
Well, very much as you say, he was the point man for the movement to politicize evangelical Christianity, which until that point had not really been activated too much formally from the pulpits, largely due to fear of running afoul of the IRS, but also fear of alienating congregation members who would not agree necessarily, because social sorting was such that you didn't really have the sort of ideologically pure strain congregations that you have now. So people rightly were worried about alienating potential congregants. But Falwell, in the crisis moment of the 70s, when not only you had things like the ERA fight and Roe versus Wade, but more important than anyone, you had the fight over the tax-exempt status of private Christian colleges and schools.
Right.
That was the real rallying cry, because it was an existential threat to the institution of like Christian, like Southern, specifically white Christian, self-perceived culture.
I see. Yeah. So this thing about the tax exemptions, what was Bob Jones University the key?
It was one of them. But the thing is that it was an attempt by the IRS to deal with something that had emerged as a consequence of the Brown versus Education ruling and the formal desegregation of Southern schools. It took a long time, it took decades, really, to formalize all of the different desegregation plans for all of the school districts throughout the South. They often required their own specific court orders and consent decrees and a process that took years. And while that process was happening, the cream of Southern white childhood was being surreptitiously removed from public schools and put into emerging Christian academies, private schools that were created for the express purpose of resegregating the school system by just taking themselves from the public domain and creating private schools. And the IRS recognized that these private schools held the function of perpetuating segregation. So they said, unless schools provide a roadmap and a good faith effort to integrate, they will not be able to claim the tax-exempt status of a religious institution. And that brought a massive awakening of political consciousness to the pulpits across the South, but not just the South. And it helped galvanize the modern movement because it was that energy that was conducted into the series of meetings that led to the formation of the moral majority.
Right. Yeah. So this provided a really tangible opportunity to sort of organize and unify politically and enter that sphere, kind of mesh those two worlds. How big a deal was moral majority as an organization and a force in the political sphere?
It was the moral majority's vocabulary and production that I would argue was one of the most important things in exacerbating the eventual comprehensive realignment of Southern white voters away from the Democrats to the Republicans.
Okay, yeah. So like that sort of 1970s realignment of that.
It started in the 60s, obviously, but
yeah,
it took a lot of efforts to maintain the trajectory over the years. And there was push back and forth, and Jimmy Carter was able to win the South handily in 1976 partially because he was an evangelical Christian, because that was still a public religious persuasion that was relatively novel, at least in terms of mainstream politics and culture, and as opposed to regional Southernism. And it was only over the course of his term, Carter's term, that the explicitly religious right wing began to fatally and conclusively turn towards the Republicans as the only party that could possibly represent their values.
Right. Yeah. Carter didn't do so hot, and he certainly lost that that religious sell, and it wasn't really enough anymore at that point to just be an evangelical. The politics had to be embodied in their policy too.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels like 1970s was a really important turning point for identifying a lot of these issues that evangelicals still organize around today. Obviously there was the threat of queer people existing, prayer inside a school, and then a really big one that was kind of a unifier, Roe v. Wade.
Yes. That's another big one.
Yeah. So the Roe v. Wade decision, what do you make of that decision in terms of the context of when it happened, and what were sort of the implications of its decision just across the political sphere?
Well, I'm not really an expert on legal element of it, but
sure.
Roe v. Wade was, it introduced a moral quandary into a religiously inflected moral quandary into the public sphere that had previously been sort of sublimated out of it, which of course increases the emotional and religious dynamic of people's voting understanding and political understanding. And one of the most important impacts it had was to bring Protestants around to the importance of social issues as an organizing principle, because Catholics had sort of held the popular patent on decency mobilizations, questions around censorship, questions around like birth control and those kind of things were really the providence of the of Catholic clergy and Catholic organizations, Legion of Decency and such. But and at first, right after Roe versus Wade, the evangelicals did not rally to the cause. It was not instantaneous. It took several years for the right, the Christian, the Protestant right, to sort of awaken to the emergency, the moral emergency of abortion. Because at first there was no real unified theological take on the nature of it, the way that there was with the Catholic Americans. And so but as other issues came to the fore, like that unified them, like the question of tax exempt status for religious schools, they came together around a whole bunch of different axes of social reaction, and abortion became one of them. And eventually, evangelicals took the torch and carried it much, much farther than the Catholics ever did in terms of turning opposition to abortion rights into a totemic, like soul-defining political struggle.
Right. Yeah. So it was this opportunity for those two groups to kind of unite in their conservatism and their concern for social conservatism specifically. It's funny. I was watching some videos in preparation for this episode just to kind of read up on the history and learn a bit. And I got this ad for I believe it was called the Militant Catholic Voter Guide.
Oh, snap.
It was intense. I had the option to skip, but it caught my eye, and a little free plug here for the Militant Catholic Voter Guide. If anybody listening to this is Catholic, don't know who to vote for, check it out. A very intense man will explain to you the concern of Marxists and all their winning, and how that's a big threat to Catholics. So the scripture of Christianity and the theology, some would argue that the New Testament specifically is pretty radical. You hear, it's cliche, but you hear that phrase of, oh, Jesus was a Jewish socialist. And it gets a little played out, but I think there's certainly a point to be made about how the Bible, specifically the gospel of Jesus' actions, sort of embody this collectivist framework. I've talked to a lot of Christian people my age who are looking into the DSA, stuff like that, and a lot of them cite a direct reading of the New Testament as a sort of radicalizing thing for them, in sort of noticing the contradictions of conservative evangelicals. What do you make of how the evangelical theology and the evangelical right, how does it address these crises of capitalism that we're facing, and kind of continue to serve as this vehicle for right-wing politics?
Well, I think because at this point, American Protestantism, which is to say, like, American Christianity writ large, has been drained of a spiritual dimension as much as every other element of social life in America has been drained of social meaning. And the kingdom of heaven has been turned into your backyard, your patio, your ability to the bounty of America's physical splendor and the ability of settlers to claim vast swaths of it over the course of our centuries of existence, and then our ability to somehow emerge as the hegemon that's able to marshal all the resources of the world for its own material indulgence, means that most Christians, I think, today in America imagine the kingdom of God as a thing to recreate out of the physical world, which requires them to be able to acquire without hindrance, without having to consider something like their requirements and their moral obligations to their fellow Christians, who they don't view anymore. They don't view with any more they don't view with any sort of moral imagination. Don't consider as in any way as brothers, and that at this point in the terminal death spiral of America, where it's going to be harder and harder to get those holy pleasures that have been that people have confused themselves into thinking mean something. It's only going to further the need to violently enforce control and hierarchy at the top to maintain that ability to exploit and hyper exploit.
Yeah, it's a pretty kind of perverse manifestation of this thought, this process of going about things. A group of people whose thought we haven't really talked about yet, but who continue to play a bigger role by the day in sort of the political imagination of what a conservative Christian is the uniquely American and at times bewildering Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Hell yes, my boys. The boys yes. And girls. The
yes,
people who cracked the code.
They figured it out, folks. They know what's going on.
They saw what was coming. They saw that the traditional European Christianity was going to be incompatible with whatever the hell America was throwing up. And so they went west and shaped something totally new, unique, and syncretic out in the desert, which has led them to be basically the only people in America for whom capitalism works anything like it imagined itself, and we tell ourselves it does. Because they have enmeshed capitalism into a social network and use it as a social transmission element, have suborned it basically to their social body, while the rest of us idiotically just allowed ourselves to be totally hollowed out by a fucking parasite.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, perfectly said. It's a little wild when the sort of Pope figure in Mormonism is referred to as a president, because it feels like this Americanization of Christianity in this.
Yeah, because they understood that America was going to be so big that the American psyche was going to become so all-consuming that it would not be able to hold on to these far-off concepts from when they were all squashed together on islands and in prince bishoprics sprinkled across the hinterlands of Europe. Well, they're going to be they were remaking a continent, for God's sakes, and that meant that their forms were going to be monumental, and that means that they needed a religion that reflected that, and that means they needed a religion that had reference to only itself and did not give some sort of tribute to these dead ways.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a bit of genius there in Joseph Smith's foundation of that church, in how he was able to kind of just build this thing and correct all of the contradictions of Christianity in the United States. So it seems like where the evangelical and Protestant kind of manifestation of Christianity is this sort of perversion of the theology, while maintaining the facade that they still do prize the original texts.
Yes. Well, yeah,
Mormonism,
they prize like a flattened version.
right? Yeah, yeah, a very
Whereas
basic.
where they've replaced they've completely drained it of meaning, and it's the document itself sort of desacralized.
Yeah, exactly. And where that happens in the sort of evangelical right, and all these contradictions kind of come to a fore. There's not really any contradictions in the scripture of uh, Mormonism, because they have another book that they can refer
Not
to.
only do they have another book, the prophets are essentially they've got the go ahead to adapt and redefine and rewrite the scripture as they want to.
Yeah,
It's amazing. It's like,
it's
oh, everyone's mad at us for being racist because of the thing about black people. Shit, we don't believe that anymore. Man, people really aren't getting over this whole polygamy thing. Fuck. Instead of, I guess we're going to have to fight to the death, and we're going to have to suicide bomb our way through the West. They just go, oh, no, yeah, no, we don't do that anymore.
yeah. I mean, you gotta give them some props. They figured out a pretty sustainable model.
The whole project is very impressive.
Absolutely. So you have been receiving a lot of praise lately for a project of yours started within the Chapo universe with your streams, and they're very good. I'm a fan of the streams. A stream I particularly enjoyed was the one where you discuss the Demiurge.
Good old Demiurge.
If you don't mind, could you just briefly, to kind of wrap up, explain what that means and how you see it kind of fitting in today?
That diabolical old fiend Yaldabaoth, the Demiurge. So the Demiurge is a concept that emerges first out of a Platonic heathen tradition, but then emerges in early Christianity as a way to square the circle of living on this planet with these institutions and these bodies while being asked to live as Christ did, and finding that is such a great an incommensurability, such an impossibility, that either God doesn't really love us and he's fucking with us, or we are being prevented from returning to God by the intervention of an evil spirit, the Demiurge, Beelzebub, who confines us into an illusory material prison of flesh and in material conditions of oppression and exploitation and greed and war and lust and everything else, all of which keep us from God. And that it is through the application of strict mental powers that you can achieve something called gnosis, which is a reckoning with that spiritual plane. And like what they're describing it's also described in Buddhism. It's the process of attempting to achieve transcendence, which is possible for any person. But the specific notion of the Demiurge, I think, is useful because it also maps onto the condition of the material human removed from a religious perspective, and capitalism. Capitalism is the intervening force that shapes us in such a way that we cannot recognize our common humanity and live as Christians, as Buddhists, as every best version of every religious tradition and secular ethical tradition would imagine we would live. And that the battle to defeat capitalism is a Gnostic conflict with a presiding force, a demonic, a glamour that turns a bountiful world which we could live in harmony with and in harmony with each other into a rat's warren of conflict and terror and misery because of the enforced scarcity necessary to power massive profit extraction and surplus being taken by a corrupt a parasitic class.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, that's a great way to put it. That's a fantastic explanation of a concept I don't think many people have heard of. I certainly hadn't until I heard you explain it. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I'm always glad I got a chance to talk things out a little bit.
Yeah, of course. So this has been a awesome little discussion on, a bit of a brief history of the Christian right and some of their theology and how it works today. Before we wrap up, is there any final thoughts you have or anything you want to plug?
I just think that there's going to be a spiritual rebirth of the left. Like there's going to be a resacralization of the public space. And I don't know what it's going to look like, and I don't know if it's going to be enough or if it's too late. But when it shows up, I just want to say I called it.
Awesome. Well, God willing, when it does happen, inshallah, I can say
inshallah,
called it. All right. Well, Matt, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you taking some time to talk with me. Have a great rest of your night.
You too. Thank you.